Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining this LinkedIn live stream. I'm Will Morrish. I'm the VP and General Manager for AlertLogic. AlertLogic, for those of you that don't know, we're really leading the pack and helping define and deliver managed detection and response services out to the marketplace. I'm joined today by Martin Riley, who's the CTO at Timico. He's one of the leading managed service providers. Martin's really helping define the service propositions and how they're integrating services and delivering them to the enterprise. I'm also joined by Tony Haywood. Tony Haywood is the Chief Technology Officer and Director of Security at Progress. Progress are one of our distribution partners that are working and helping enable value-added resellers and helping them go out to the market and helping the enterprise of all sizes, from the mid-market to the large, help secure and better protect their enterprises. Today, we're not going to be focusing on AlertLogic. What we're really going to be focusing on today is about a far more broader range of topics. It's really about what is the importance of security right now. We're going to be talking about what are the key things as a business you should be thinking about. What are the challenges that we're all seeing? And from the experiences that the three of us have all got out into the marketplace, and what are some key takeaways you can take as the IT leaders or the security leaders in your own business to make sure that you are protected for the next month, the next year, and as your business continues to grow. Martin, just want to say a quick hello?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me on this event. It's a pleasure to be joining you both.
Great, so thanks. And Tony?
Good afternoon, Will and Martin. Again, thank you for inviting me. Pleasure to contribute.
Great, thanks so much. So before we sort of go into the question and answer session, we do want to keep this as a live program. For any of you that are watching, please do add any questions. We'd love to get that involved in the conversation. A couple of things that we're definitely seeing from AlertLogic's perspective into the marketplace. We are seeing certainly digital transformation continues to drive the agenda inside the enterprise. How is technology being used to be cheaper, better, faster, or more efficient to help make businesses differentiate themselves in the marketplace? We've certainly all been living through strange and different times for these last few months. And we don't want to use this session to focus particularly on COVID or what that's driven, for the fact that really has been done a great deal already. But it has increased and changed how IT is being used inside of a business. We all now work from home. It's changed the perimeter even more so than it was beforehand on where are the staff working, where is the IT stack, and also about what's the uptime, how do these stacks continue to work. Also, because of COVID, partly because of it, and also because of the general marketplace, we're also seeing budgets are certainly being constrained. We've already seen the UK is now in recession. Elsewhere in Europe, we're starting to see signs of that too. But it really does mean that every dollar that every business spends, whether it's on security or anything else in IT or elsewhere in the business, it's a question of what value are you getting? What is the value from that dollar that you spend? And a lot of what we see in the marketplace now, when we're talking to customers, it's one about increasing security, but also helping them consolidate their tools and their services to make sure that they're getting the best value. They're sort of squeezing the juice as much as they can from that budget that they've got to get the most value. Another topic that we're seeing with most customers too is really security can often be it's seen by somebody else. The other guys are the ones that get hacked, not us. We're starting to see a twist and a change of this, partly because of the business continuity plans that we all had as business leaders. Those weren't right. None of us expected to be taken out of our offices for months on end, which has also meant that people are now starting to look at what are their BCP plans that then sit around security. Well, what happens if our site's down for an hour? What happens if our ERP is down for a day? What happens if it's down for a month? All of these things can massively impact your capability to not only run your day-to-day operations of your business, but can also impact significantly the growing and longevity and health of your actual business as well. So those are some of the key things that we're seeing, but really what I want to do today is have it as an open conversation between Martin and Tony and myself to really just see what are we seeing in the marketplace, and again, what are some key takeaways you can get from this. So first of all, question I'm going to throw it out to Martin. So what's the most sort of common question or challenge that you're hearing out in the market with regards to security?
I say you've touched on a couple already, Will, and I think the two that I see the most is one, complexity. How do we make life a lot easier and simpler when it comes to security as a whole? But I think the key one that I have with most of the business leaders, CIO, C-level, is around the articulation of the value that security brings. As you say, there's budgets being squeezed, but people normally see a tool or a product or a vendor as part of a solution. It's very hard to articulate the value of a security system as a whole when you think of the people, the processes, products and services that integrate into that. And it's trying to articulate and fight for a budget without fear-mongering, which is the hardest part to do. I mean, if we look at GDPR, there's been a huge amount of hype and fear-mongering around the cost of GDPR and what those fines might be on businesses. But if you look at the cost of a security breach and responding to it, the single largest aspect of loss is usually revenue, whether that's immediate revenue because you're unavailable to trade, or it's the reputational damage after the fact. That's not necessarily something that's factored in as part of the whole. So it's when you're designing a security system, whether that's people and process and the tools and the vendors that you work with, how do you mitigate and reduce that risk? It's a fact of life that security issues and incidents happen. It's just how you go about resolving and articulating those. So for us, the key benefit is, as you mentioned, digital transformation is a huge topic and agenda right now, driven by some of the recent pandemic causes, but it's also been a topic for the last 5 years. So how do we insert security into that strategic discussion? We need to be secure by design and not an afterthought, because when you're an afterthought, you're always scrabbling at the table for the little bits of money that's left on the table. So we need to be putting ourselves into the middle of the strategy and help the business move forward so that we can do it in a secure way.
Great stuff. And Tony, what are you seeing from the sort of reseller side of the marketplace as well?
Well, I think Martin's raised some very good points that I'm absolutely aligned and in agreement with. But I would add that the organisations that I talk to on a regular basis at XO level are extremely reluctant to make further investment in more technology when they can't train, retain, and operate the technology they've already bought with any degree of efficiency. That's why, and that's part of the reason why these organizations are looking to rely more heavily on specialist managed security providers, because they're able to offload the burden of ownership, management, maintenance, updating, patching, and providing the technical staff to operate capability onto a third party. So they literally become the consumers of the positive outcome rather than having to drive and maintain the technology internally. So really the questions that I'm asked on a regular basis is in the line of, stop selling me your stuff. We don't need more technology. We can't operate the technology we already have with any degree of competence. It's more about how can I optimize the effectiveness of my security operations, and in doing so, reduce both cost and time to respond. And in some instances, our e-commerce business, where we rely on resiliency and consistency of service, how can we implement a security model that matches our trading model, which is 24/7? And as soon as organizations realize that's a fourfold cost increase, then that's a significant problem.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point you make. I think we're definitely seeing a move, partly to that managed service piece. I think it aligns to the way that IT sort of generally gone. Is if we look at the market 10 years ago, I'd say that most people had got reasonable in-house development teams. They were trying to do all the IT stack. How many people were running sort of their own at the most basic level, like an Exchange stack or Notes and others? That stuff's a pain in the backside. Microsoft have come along with Office 365 and Google with the G Suite, and it's really got to the point of what is the value to the business of running something that can be taken from somewhere that's going to be run it somewhat better. And I think you're right when it comes to the security piece and the outsourcing this, is we know that people could in theory do this themselves. Everybody could continue to run their own Exchange environment if they wanted to. But what's the value that it's going to bring to the business? And is it intrinsic to the success of that business? And typically, I think that's one of the things that we definitely see is that no, it's not. And they're not going to be as good or have the capability to do so. So that outsourcing tends to work. Martin, you raised an interesting point when you were talking about value. And from being a managed service provider, a lot of the conversations in the MSP world tend to start with a project. It's part of the digital transformation that a customer is going to go through, and they will start with one portion of this. Are you starting to see that customers are taking a more holistic approach to outsourcing all of their IT stack, or far larger portions than they previously would have done?
I think it still varies technology from technology. Again, if you look at the digital agendas of a lot of businesses, you're starting to see newer technologies emerge, or the pushing forward of concepts such as DevOps. But they're not things that are done as a whole across an entire organization. They're usually things that are done by either business unit, or application by application. So this is where you start to get 3 or 4 or 5 different clouds into an enterprise's mix, because you've got one application stack that's pushing into AWS, but you've got another that sits better in Azure, and you're starting to see less of a control. And I think that's where security as a whole still wins in terms of some of the outsource opportunities, because having an in-house capability to look after the tools that you've got is great. But when your landscape changes daily, weekly and monthly, you're bringing on new clouds, new technology, you've got new challenges to address, constantly retraining, developing, having those 24/7 teams, and then ensuring the skills are there to cover it all. It's very difficult, which is again why outsourcing to a managed service provider, even around certain elements of security that give you the governance or the view of the landscape as a whole, then that gives massive value back to a business, rather than trying to retain and grow a security team that quite honestly will end up larger than the development teams themselves. So if it's the development teams that are driving the value to the business, and that's what your customers are paying you for, then you need to get rid of the cost or reduce that cost to be able to do the rest of the security operations.
Yeah, I agree. I think it all goes back to that bang for the buck. If you're a business that is in, say, logistics or something, you really want your money to be spent on making that logistics application. The other stuff that's peripheral within IT isn't the place where you want your budget to be spent. And another question sort of following on from that, there are the security marketplace is full of vendors, and every vendor, or certainly most of them, say, we stop attacks, we do this. Every EDR provider, every antivirus provider, they're never going to say, well, we do our best. But they always purvey to say that we will stop it. How reasonable do you think is it to expect that all attacks can actually be blocked? I'll throw that one to Tony first of all. Do you think the investment in technology can ever be taken where you can say, you know what, I've got enough tools and suites of protection that I just feel I'm not going to be attacked, or a successful attack is going to get through?
Well, that's a very interesting point. And I would say, is it possible to really identify and stop a threat that's truly zero day or unknown, against a vulnerability that might not even have been identified yet, that may well affect your business in a serious way? Is it possible to stop that? Probably not. But organizations can significantly limit or reduce the impact of potential threats, and particularly zero day, by not only making best use of their existing investment in technology and managing it in a way where they're very confident that they not only understand the capability, but they've optimized and tuned it to be truly effective, but then blend that with selected or specialist security services, where you're able to utilize the latest advances in technology without impacting your business agility or your ability to be effective as an organization. So what I'm really saying is, do I believe it's genuinely realistic to say there's a silver bullet that kills all bad things? No, but you can significantly lower the risk by ensuring that your existing technology is used correctly, appropriately, and optimized. And then you use existing specialist managed security providers to complement that security profile, using the latest technology that doesn't burden or impact your business. So you're not having to train and retain new people to operate the latest advanced technology. You're not having to impact your business with long deployment or evaluation criteria. This is something that you can then rely on that extra or the additional layer of coverage. And I would also point out as well that depending on the managed security provider, they can have a global perspective of the current threat landscape. And when you're dealing with that kind of provider, they can bring insight into your organization that you would never be able to provide with your current team, because they may well identify a set of attacks or a set of behaviors that ultimately result in a business being impacted, that are in the same commercial vertical as you, in the same geography, and that means that you're likely to have the same attack happen in your area. So converting that intelligence into something actionable by implementing a particular change to firewalls or IPS or a similar defense platform, you may make your business more resilient to that kind of attack in the future. So that's generally the approach I see people using or looking at, is having the service providers do the heavy lifting with new technology. So it's almost like a service to evaluate capability before it's adopted into existing infrastructure.
Yeah, great. And what are your thoughts, Martin? Do you think 100% is possible or anywhere near it? And how often do you see sort of CTOs, CIOs or CISOs that speak to Timico and sort of have that as an opinion at the start of the conversation?
I think it's becoming more aware in the market that 100% is almost impossible. I think the CISOs that I speak to regularly realize that security incidents are a way of life. We know of the plethora of phishing attacks that go on pretty much any and every day. So it's a common reality. And no matter how mature you are, you need to appreciate that you can invest in technology, but you need the services and understanding to be able to bring those together and put insights against them. As Tony said, there's a number of zero-day vulnerabilities out there, and they're constantly coming out. So the only way to be able to protect against that is to have an understanding of what some of those attack patterns are. Whether you look at things like micro-attack matrix or kill chain, then they all have a similar pattern for either infection, breach, and detection. So it's how do you put intelligence, which I think is the key tool to a cyber defense, over the top of everything that you've got. You've probably made some good investments in some good technology and security tools already, but you're not leveraging the information that's held within them, or you're not coupling what's coming out of your firewall with what's coming out with your servers. But if you put the two together, you start to see a pattern that doesn't exist. So it's how do you leverage what you've already made the investment in to be able to reduce that risk? And if we look at the number of vendors and technologies that's come to market, or the amount of spend that continues to grow in the cyber market, you look at the cyber reports, but the average detection time isn't coming down. It's still hovering at around 207, 210 days, and it's been there for the last 6 years. That's not because we're not spending more money on security. It's because the threats and the attacks are becoming a lot more mature and sophisticated. So it is, to a degree, a continual arms race. But I think the key response to that is, as I mentioned, intelligence. That comes in the way of threat intelligence, global threat intelligence ideally, but simple measures such as, again, the knowledge of the attack patterns, but vulnerability management, just understanding what these systems look like and what you have to be able to defend, are key tools to be able to reduce the risk. There is no silver bullet, as Tony says, so it's how do we reduce the risk as a whole? And for me, breach detection and incident response are a necessity and reality to reduce the cost and impact of those breaches, rather than just throwing more money at another tool.
Yeah, agreed. I think it's one of my favourite sort of analogies that people use is the idea of the security onion. It's not one layer that's going to actually solve it. It's the multitude of them together. I had a great conversation actually yesterday, where it was a customer saying, "But I've got all the licenses for Paolo at the perimeter of my network, at the outside of my data center. I'm super confident it's got it. Paolo is saying that it's got really good IPS. Should I use that, or should I use the service that alert logic?" It's got, well, use both of them. Because it's sort of the two sides of the coin. Is one side of them is all about lowering that level of risk, whether it's vulnerabilities, whether it's sort of patching, whether it's just mistakes that are sort of dumb thumb events by users, or whether it's IPS that is going to block stuff. That's all good. But it's then taking the intel and that telemetry data from that perimeter and then mixing it with the intel that you've then got on the backside of the network to then look for those correlations for that anomaly events, for the things that do slip through. And I think you are right. It's all about that there's a net. You've got to treat it as something will always get through. And it's the case of making sure that when things get through, that your posture is such that it's all about reducing the blast radius of the damage. Of it shouldn't be 200 days. It shouldn't be a day. If somebody gets in, it's got to be far, far tighter. And it's obviously why we're at 15 minutes on that. The point is if somebody's in it.
With 207 days for a breach to be detected, it takes less than 2 hours for a perpetrator to do lateral movement. So if you're not detecting it within 2 hours, then your entire system is compromised, not just one.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I think the other thing is going back to the question of is anybody 100% safe? You could probably say, well, Travelex felt pretty confident. Garmin felt pretty confident. They all felt pretty confident. And it's not to be cocky from the sake of, well, could any provider or particular technology have stopped that? Maybe. But I think the thing that definitely seems to be similar of looking at some of these attacks from the outside, I think Garmin was an interesting one, just for the fact of it looks like somebody got in, obviously, but they were then able to get in right the way across what can only be considered a fair size infrastructure that actually sits behind them. That isn't the matter that somebody got in and it wormed its way across in a couple of minutes. That was somebody in there for quite some time doing damage and building up to that attack. And so it's a case of, trying to make sure that you can lower that level of risk. But if somebody does get in, make sure that they're caught. I believe we've also just had a question come through that will come up on the screen in a second. So do you think the time management with implementing security layers in the business model will deflect costs? So meaning scheduled times and implemented security teams will perform the measures for checks and balances. Martin, what's your thought? Do you think the sort of time management with implementing this will deflect the costs of it? The sort of bang for buck that you're investing into this and the time, because it is always going to take time to do these, will offset the costs of the damage that could happen?
Just reading the question, there's a couple of things that spring to mind in terms of what do you do first. I think there are things that you can do first. Again, you've already made investments into tools. So it's what services or what intelligence, as I described it, can you put over the top of what you've already got to be able to reduce the risk. But if you're looking to do it in-house and you're scheduling security teams that you own and run to be able to perform functions, then unless that's a 24/7 coverage, you're instantly leaving exposure. If you're performing checks or doing knowledge transfer 9 to 5, you're only covering roughly 30 to 40% of your business week. What happens to the 60% that you're not covering, and how do you respond to that? So you can reduce costs by scheduling or having part coverage from a security operations perspective, but you're not really covering the whole risk.
Yeah, agreed. Tony, any sort of additional points on that?
Probably three key points. I think the most resilient cybersecurity infrastructures that I've seen and had to work with have always been the result of a carefully orchestrated evolution rather than revolution. There are no knee-jerk reactions here. It's a well thought through process. And obviously budgeting and expense comes into that at some point. There's one point I'd make as well about threat intelligence, and particularly where managed service providers or specialist service providers come into play. And that's whatever it is that you're telling me in intelligence, if it's not actionable, it might be interesting, but it's a waste of my time. The art in good security intelligence that impacts your security defenses is in making that intelligence actionable. So a managed provider with a global perspective of the threat landscape will be able to identify behaviors desirable or undesirable and be able to extract a set of actions that are not only relative and appropriate to your business, but implementable to make you more resilient. But to answer the point in the recent question there, I would choose to always limit the impact of any expenditure in a security in-depth or a layered strategy by having different service providers or the same provider do the heavy lifting with implementation of new technology or capability. In the same way, it supports very good business agility to be able to work with a very competent, strong provider where you can determine this afternoon we will switch over from one MDR platform to another based on the latest industry statistics, where they're able to reflect or identify threat in a much greater degree than my previous provider. So to the organization themselves, there's actually no impact on time. There's no impact on cost or budget. This is simply a task that the managed service provider has to react to and implement for the client as part of their service. So I would support a in-depth strategy or a layered approach with a carefully managed evolution, but make sure you utilize your service providers and your partners in such a way that you limit the impact on any expenditure. particularly when budgets are so stretched at the moment.
Yeah, indeed. And I think to add on to the point that you were making there about the sort of the intelligence piece, I think a lot of this also comes back to, I think the key thing in security for me is always about context. It's about context of the business. It's about context of the application stack. It's about context of the implications that that's got to the business, and also what the overall wider risk is and the threat of any particular vulnerability, attack, or vector that can be used against that. It's an interesting one. We often get conversations about, well, how much should I automate my security? If I see an attack come in, should I have sort of a full SOAR capability where it's going to do automated whack-a-mole? Yes, in some degrees, shuns on firewalls and other things, yes, in certain cases. But there are others where it's the case, well, actually, an attacker's got in. If they've got in and they're only sort of doing the initial portions of recon, if it's completely automated and it's your busiest time, you know that nothing is actually damaged yet. Should all the systems be shut down? Should it all be completely turned off? Or should there be a staged approach to extricate that threat? And I think it's always one of those things on security. It's about what is the context of the risk and the platform and the stack. And then that then flows on what should be the next steps on how the remediation piece should go. I think
that's a good point, Will. Oh, I'm sorry. Please go.
No, you carry on, please.
So the automation and orchestration part in context of security, I think, is quite important. There are certain aspects where the technologies that service providers use, where they're using the latest machine or deep learning to be able to filter through a high volume of noise that wouldn't actually affect the infrastructure, because they have an awareness of not only the client and the infrastructure they're working with, but the client's business. And that can be highly effective, which focus analysts' time on to the things that do need to be focused on. So if you like, for simply filtering things that can be easily identified as either unusual, undesirable, or malicious, automation providing that you're not making decisions based on source IP addresses that can't be spoofed, that's perfectly appropriate. But there's always the requirement for that shaking of the haystack to watch the three needles fall at the bottom. And it's those three needles are the things that the human analyst needs to focus on, because machines are fantastic with automation and orchestration to tease down the analyst's attention, but there's still no substitute for the experience of the analyst to look at those three things remaining. And to that point, that's one of the difficulties I think we might have mentioned earlier about how do you train and retain that expertise if you are running your own security operations center, because the burn rate is so incredibly high for analysts. So how do you keep that knowledge and experience that understands your business and also understands the threat landscape and can put the two things together?
Yeah, it's an interesting one actually to do with the retaining the staff. So for the larger enterprises where they have got their own SOC, the analogy is sort of shaking the haystack for the three things to fall out. I think one of the challenges that companies have with that, retaining that security expertise, is it's one IT stack that they're constantly shaking, just waiting for the one thing to come out. That's a huge amount of white noise for a start. And then the actual exciting thing that SOC analysts love getting their teeth into is when something is happening. And where people have built their own teams and it's their own scene that they've only got looking after their own stuff, there isn't enough excitement in there typically that you see to sort of get people and get them involved. And I think that's also why there's a huge amount of movement within the general security industry, because people want to be in the exciting roles. It's one of the things that I always notice when I go to the SOC. The SOC teams love working there for the fact they work over a bunch of different customers, and there is always something that they can get their teeth into. And whether instead of hunting just in one customer, they can hunt across a multitude of them and actually start to theorize, well, hang on, I've seen something that looks odd. Have we seen this anywhere else? That's the sort of stuff that SOC analysts love getting their teeth into.
While we're using the analogy as well, if you want to quantify the size of the haystack you're shaking to try and tease out what amongst all these security events are actually realistic and something I need to investigate, a financial institution I was working with in the city quite recently have 18 billion security events per month. Now, what process would you have to work through to try and chain some of those events together that any one of them individually isn't a cause for concern, but several of them in sequence would be a strong indicator of compromise or of malicious activity that could be a strong indicator of an attack that's coming. So being able to filter that down and apply that global lens to say, where else in the world has this activity been seen recently, and was it important enough to immediately react to, from an analyst's point of view, is very, very engaging. It's part of a detective mystery, rather than being an individual stuck in your own SOC, only focusing on a bulk volume of spam email that you need to work out every day is anything malicious. So that staff retention is another element of the security business that can be successfully passed out to a managed security provider who doesn't have those same challenges.
Yeah, no, agreed. And I think another one, I'm sort of following on from that, I think one of the other things that we definitely see more of, and certainly the boarding businesses are getting this, is where they're looking at incident response, and people are starting to talk a lot more now about cyber insurance policies. They're certainly being pushed to do so of, well, actually, if I spend this amount of money, well, this is actually great. It means that I'm going to get the equivalent of a brand new shiny car. I think the challenge that we see is, fair enough, you may have your car insurance, but if you hit a tree, it's going to take some time until you've got the car again. There's a huge amount of time between those two events actually happening. But Martin, what's your thoughts on where people see that cyber insurance could be the panacea, or it could be good enough to protect their business?
Well, I think if I were to follow in the crashing the car analogy, I think I would be driving down the road, crash my Ferrari, where I probably get given a Mercedes as a replacement. You don't get a full value replacement. Again, the cost of a security breach isn't just the initial breach. If you look at some of the reports that are out there, it's detection, containment, but then it's actually the immediate remediation of whether it's notifying customers, dealing with penalties for compliance, or remediation, repudiation back to the customers. They're the initial things that you got to deal with, but there is still a long tail of cost that you'll have to deal with, as I mentioned up front, in terms of reputational damage, loss of earnings. These are things that an insurance policy won't cover. But even the insurance providers now are requiring some level of a security audit and assessment. Probably, I've been through a few here at Timico. Again, we provide services to a number of customers, and as such, we have some element of insurance. And the process that the insurers put me through is far more rigorous than my ISO standards that I have as well. So even just to meet the requirements of the insurer, they understand that if you're an incompetent driver, or if you're going to be drink driving, they're not going to pay out anyway. So they have to have the assurance that you are a good citizen, as it were, in terms of your security posture before they'll even provide you the cyber insurance. They're not just going to give it willy-nilly. Or if you do, you can guarantee there's a lot of clauses in there that you're not going to get much back.
Yeah, great. Tony?
Well, I think Martin's captured that as a response perfectly. I was involved in a root cause analysis for a pharmaceutical business that had a number of repeated compromises on the same platform. And when it comes down to cybersecurity in general, due to the complexity of the environments, the security controls, the type of attacks that may have been used, it always comes down to a matter of debate, and long-winded and expensive debate, as to, is there actually a claim, or was the organization deficient or negligent in some way that means that the claim would be invalidated. And I think in all those cases, or rather, I'm not aware of one organization that's invested in insurance that has been the result of a compromise, and they've tried to claim on that policy, have it ever been paid out successfully. So perhaps insurance companies, if we had a representative on the call, would radically disagree with that. But I would say most businesses doing a cost versus risk analysis on cyber insurance for their business will very quickly fall on the side of, well, actually, this isn't justified. And if you look at the organizations that have suffered significant embarrassing breaches, like Kinetic years ago, for example, where it was reported that hackers in China used their network as a playground, was the quote, for a number of years. Did it impact their share price and their market cap? Well, of course it did. But did they very quickly and very shortly recover from that? Absolutely. So I think the clever bean counters, the sort of head of spreadsheets and maths in these organizations, would tap this out quite quickly on a calculator and say, it's a calculated risk. And in most situations, the risk doesn't warrant the cost. But I'm more than happy to be proved wrong on that point.
No, I'd agree. I don't think we've definitely seen when we're talking to people about insurance, they do pay out, but there are certainly caveats onto that. I think one of the base caveats you see in lots of policies is of you must be patched throughout your estate and have no known vulnerabilities. I'd love to see any business of any reasonable size that can honestly hang their hat and say, I'm absolutely fully patched. I know I've got no vulnerabilities anywhere. IT systems don't work that way. There is always something that needs to be done, and it's a challenge to keep up with it. And I think the other side about the policy of, yes, if you're taken out and all of your laptops have got ransomware on them and you need to go and do a mess and buy all of your laptops, yes, that may pay out. But if you're in, say, a logistics business, what it's not going to pay out for is if you can't operate for 2 days, all of your customers still need their boxes delivering. They're just going to go to your competitor, and you know what? They're probably going to get a pretty sweet deal out of it, and they're probably going to get some A-class service, which then means that your business may go elsewhere, and that's things that aren't really going to get covered in that policy. Just aware of the time, we were going to do about 30 to 40 minutes or so I'm going to finish on one last question to both of you. So what parts of security should a CIO and CEO, frankly, it is keenly their responsibility. What are the things that they should really have in-house as tools, things that sit underneath their wing, and what are the things that they should outsource to a service provider, either directly to managed service providers such as AlertLogic, or as a wider point of view through a managed service provider like Timico? We'll start with Tony on that.
Wow. I was hoping you weren't. I think it was going to be Martin that would take the bullet for the team there.
I thought I'd start with you, and then I can finish with the MSP. So.
Wow. I would say, and this always sounds evasive, but I don't mean it to be. I think it really depends on the organization, because from the CIO's lens that they would view their business through, they'll be trying to understand how they achieve and maintain the desired level of regulatory compliance and how they measure their success against that, as well as information retention and what policies and security controls they have in place to ensure that. So I would certainly, if that were my responsibility, remove that to one side and directly take ownership of making sure that those measurables and deliverables are clearly achievable. However, at a lower level within the business operation, within the security context, whether the team that are providing the security defense or implementing the security controls are my own team with the right level of skill, professionalism and expertise, or whether that's a third party, is almost transparent to me. Obviously, I'm aware and obviously I'm informed, but I would move all of the measurable and deliverables with regards to regulatory compliance and deciding on what policies and processes are implemented and operational. That would come directly under my authority and direct responsibility and accountability. Whereas the delivery, I wouldn't be too concerned whether that was internal or external to my business.
Brilliant. Martin.
I'll try not to be too biased as a service provider, but I think Tony's pretty much right there. It depends on the organization, and because it comes down to what I was talking up front in terms of the business strategy, but also budget. If I have a rather large budget, then I'm going to pick and choose certain things that will be done in-house. They're going to be, again, the key skills that are niche to my business and what drive value into my customers. Now, some of that could still be security operations in one way, shape or form. If you look at the likes of Google, for example, they've been using site reliability engineering for years, but they've also adopted security into that, or the common term DevSecOps in other areas. So there is still a nucleus of that there is in-house, yet they still get rid of the rest of the infrastructure, the platform and the noise. But if you come down the scale to the smaller businesses, you can choose to outsource pretty much anything. Again, it's focusing your budget and your efforts on what is most valuable to your business, ultimately what drives the top line or drives down cost. So it comes down to those individual organizations. But the biggest struggle for anyone in the industry right now is the acquisition and retention of skills. We've all touched on it in one way, shape, or form. If you've got someone in-house, as you mentioned, they're looking after one IT stack, it gets boring. You're looking at the same things day in, day out, but you also don't get your own technical progression. You're not seeing the same things in the wild or in real life that other people are seeing, which is why you get people moving around. Add to that the shortage of skills, the salary prices go up exponentially year on year. A graduate at 25,000 year one suddenly goes to 40 to 50,000 after 1 year's experience. Retaining and attracting that talent is very hard. So where you can sensibly outsource those elements, I think it is the perfect choice to do so. But you can do everything or nothing without being too vague.
Yeah, agreed. And I think that's the thing. I think that it's interesting seeing so many different businesses and their approach to it. I'd say that anything in IT, the choice of insource or outsource depends on the aptitude, the capability, and the desired goals of the business, and how much they're wanting to achieve internally themselves. But I'd say that the key thing is it doesn't really come down to the service or the product and what they're going to do. It comes down to what's the key policy, what's their risk that they've got, how are they going to ensure adherence to that policy, and what is their overall governance to security. And some things internally, if you've got your own dev team internally, well, you're going to want to do things like your own firewall changes and things, likely because that's part of a contiguous sort of rollout of how you are doing your delivery. But outside of that, do you want to be doing the rest of security? Probably not, because you're not going to have those teams to do it. And really going back onto those frequent points, keeping people eyes on it, keeping the interest in there, that's really the challenge of how they're going to do it. So we've sort of hit the top of the time now. Tony, any closing points from yourself at all?
No, I found it a productive conversation. Thanks for the invitation, and perhaps on a future call we could touch on the evolution of infrastructure into the cloud environment and hybrid environments, which we won't have time for on this call, but perhaps that will be a nice future thing to cover.
That'd be great. Thanks, Tony. And Martin, any closing thoughts?
Similar to Tony, thank you very much for having me on the call. It's been a great session. Moving forward, again, if there is another opportunity, I touch on the same elements as Tony, talking about cloud, how to keep people connected, productive and secure throughout their daily lives as we move into this digital world. It'd be a fantastic topic to be discussing.
Brilliant stuff. Great. Thanks very much, gents, and thanks all for watching.
Thank you.
Security right now with Alert Logic. Thanks so much.
Thank you.